When Spy Fox first hit the scenes in 1997, it proved to be another great success for Humongous. But it wouldn't be their only new series that took off that year. In fact, this next one ended up becoming the one series that continued on, mostly for worse, after the company officially closed its doors. And that was Backyard Sports. As the name suggests, it's a series of sports games, starring 30 kids, then later kid versions of various real athletes of their times. Whether it's baseball, soccer, football, basketball, or even skateboarding, the goal of them is pure and simple: to get out there and have a good time playing the sports. Now, for this part, things are going to be a little different. Since these games don't have a linear plotline, unless you count the season play, this will be similar to the prologue, where it'll be a breakdown of the series' history, but I'll still bring up some interesting tidbits. Anywho, the project first began in the mind of game designer and illustrator Nick Merkovich. As the oldest of 5 boys, he played all sorts of backyard sports growing up, wiffle ball in particular, as well as arcade sports games. One day, while on a drive from Olympia to Seattle, he got an idea about making a sports game for kids, since this was around the time Electronic Arts started making it big with their EA Sports game line. Initially, the idea was largely inspired by and resembled the 1976 sports classic The Bad News Bears, where it would have involved controlling a team of neighborhood characters through a full season, while also traversing a pre-planned antics-filled journey. Before he would pitch it though, Merkovich consulted with others at the company to help sharpen his idea more, which ultimately led to it shifting to the more typical sports game structure of having a single game and season play options, and concentrated the focus on the actual baseball game. Now, while the game does deviate from Humongous' usual slate of adventure games, it was still able to cater to the same kind of audience the aforementioned usually go for. So, after that, he turned in his pitch to the higher-ups, and didn't hear anything back. In fact, it would sit on the shelf for at least 6 months. It probably would have been forgotten if it wasn't for one event that happened. In 1995, the Seattle Mariners made it to the MLB playoffs for the first time in their history, so you can imagine how huge of a deal this was at the time. So, with all this baseball fever in the air, Ron Gilbert decided to give the game the green light. But by then, Merkovich was busy working on another project, so the baseball game was given to 2 people: programmer Rich Moe and graphic designer Mark Pizer. Though Merkovich did supply them with the athletic experience, as he was sharing the same office with them. With the duo assembled, the project got underway, but Moe and Pizer did have some concerns. Number 1, nobody had checked to see if there was any interest in a sports game for kids. And 2, the tech the company had was built for point-and-click adventure games, not sports games. They also had concerns about how they were going to compete with EA Sports, since they were a dominant force. So, they thought it over and concluded that they weren't going to try and compete with EA, but instead take their game in a different direction than what the competition was doing. Once they had that settled, the team had 2 goals for the game: to keep the gameplay as realistic as they can, and add as much whimsy as possible. However, not everything in the gameplay was fully realistic, as the crew did add in fantastical elements to the game, mainly the power-ups, which were inspired by the ones in Mario Kart, that helped amp up the game's kid-friendliness. Now, a bit of trivia here. There were some ideas for other power-ups that didn't make it, including getting to swing with a tennis racket and placing a target in the outfield, which would have been worth 10 runs if it was hit. For the various fields, they did some tinkering in order to accommodate the variety of field surfaces and their quirks, like slowing down the kids' foot speed on sandy flats and tin can alleys suppressing home runs. Of course, while the fields each possessed a personality, it wouldn't all be complete without the kids who were playing. As a standard baseball team usually comprises of 9 players, the crew knew they needed at least 18, but they also wanted to have alternate selections. After several discussions, they ultimately settled on developing 30 kids. For Pizer, this would be a major challenge. I mean, coming up with that many kids is just crazy! So, for inspiration, Pizer and Mo turned to films and shows like Peanuts and The Sandlot to help capture the youthful tone the team was looking for, and how the former built their characters using mostly primitive shapes while also keeping flourishes to a minimum. And the first one off the drawing board was Kimmy Ekman. As for their personalities, the team based them on themselves, people they knew, or other fictional characters. For example, Lisa Crockett was modeled after Daria, Pete Wheeler was inspired by Forrest Gump, and Ashley and Sydney Weber were based on Mo's wife and sister-in-law, as well as their love of tennis and the Williams sisters. These personalities would be reflected in their designs, their movements, and the music, as each one was given their own theme music.
Angela Del Vecchio coming up to the plate. I'm gonna smack this one for sure. Sydney Weber steps up to the plate.
This young batter means business.
I'm gonna smash the ball out of here.
One other specific goal the crew wanted to aim for was racial and gender diversity, with half of the kids being girls, and the same for the ethnic ones as well. The point of this was to make it approachable, so that any kid could look at any one of them and think to themselves, hey, that kid's sort of like me, or I know a kid just like that. Another way they deviated from the norm was by coloring them as polychromatic. See, Pizer wasn't too keen on whenever an animated film or television show featured black kids, they'd all be shown being the same shade of color. So, he implemented shading variations, hoping that better reflecting the real-world spectrum of skin color would make the game more approachable, which it does. This desire for diversity didn't just apply to the players, it also did for the announcers and commentators, and out of that came Sunny Day. While Mo doesn't recall how the idea for her came up, one thing was certain. Once it was brought up, it just stuck. It's also no coincidence that this was 4 years after Gail Gardner became the first ever woman to do Major League Baseball play-by-play.
And we have our first run of the ball game. The Reds leading 1-0.
Becomes center, and the pitch. Swing! Whoops. My fly for it.
Like with the main kids, the commentators had distinct personalities of their own. Sunny herself was a know-it-all ahead of her years, and was also a real sports fan, while her partner in baseball, Vinny the Gooch, was meant to be like a young Howard Cosell.
We look forward to this game. As cold as it is, my colleagues are not as suitably garbed as I am. They are younger.
Wait a minute. The Gooch does not, under any circumstances, say hi-ho.
And built it! You better take a picture now, because this ball is out of here and it ain't coming back. The 40! The 30! The 20! The 10! The ball is over the line!
Alright, we've now reached the point I'm sure you've all been waiting for. So, let's not dance around it any longer. Out of all the Backyard Game members, there is one that stands out from the pack and would go on to become a fan favorite. And that was Pablo Sanchez. No matter which entry or version was played, it is almost universally guaranteed players are going to pick Pablo for their team. And for good reason. He is, no exaggeration, the best player of the whole bunch, simply for having the best stats of any of the kids. It's kind of funny to think that this character was originally thought up as a gag, which yes, that's how the crew first conceived him. From his short stature and potbelly, his walk, to how his proportions are more cartoonish compared to the others, and the fact he's Mexican. From the offset looking in, Pablo looks like the last kid anybody would pick to be on any sports team, which was the whole point. How so? Well, it all goes back to the initial inspiration for the game, the Bad News Bears. In the movie, the main team roster had two out-of-shape Mexican boys who barely spoke English and sparsely appeared. Pizer thought, what if those two turned out to be the best players on the team and they never knew or didn't realize it? So that's what the team ran with, which was a smart choice for them as it ended up making Pablo a compelling character. Also, the initial thought was that kids would at first ignore Pablo, but then gradually discover his awesome talents. But there were two issues with this. By that point, the creators made the decision to display the skills for every player, thus rendering the bit pointless. Plus, his nickname was the secret weapon, and it would only take one turn at bat for players to notice his true skills. Other aspects of Pablo's character were taken from some players on the Seattle Mariners, like his batting stance was a simplified take on Edgar Martinez's, and his Hispanic heritage was inspired by Alex Rodriguez, the latter of which can be reflected in his theme music.
Pablo Sanchez steps in.
Even though the secret weapon doesn't speak any English, we all know he's a rad dude.
If there was one hiccup with the character, it was his voice. Since he was written to speak almost entirely in Spanish, it only made sense to have a Latino voice actor do the job. But unfortunately, the crew had no luck finding anybody, so they ended up going with an auditioner who had taken language classes in school. After going through the regular production cycle, the game was finished and ready to step up to the plate on October 10, 1997. Interestingly, when it first started, the series was originally called Junior Sports, but then beginning with Backyard Baseball 2001, it started to be called Humongous Sports, and then later Backyard Sports. Though it went on to become another big series for Humongous, surprisingly, the first Backyard Baseball did okay, but overall underperformed. Now, this was for two reasons. It was a really new game and very different from what Humongous normally put out, so it was a little harder to market, and it was also hard to put out, since they already had 3 or more other games out in stores at that point. It could have been the end of it right there, but fortunately, it wouldn't be. Ron Gilbert told the team they weren't gonna give up on this new series until they had at least 3 titles out there, which just shows how much Gilbert believed in it. Thus, they moved forward with the second game, Backyard Soccer, released on September 26, 1998. Remarkably, within a year, the series had found its footing. Though critics criticized the game's controls and loading times, they did praise its graphics on all platforms, and it went on to be a big hit. So, the next year, they came out with Backyard Football on September 14, 1999. Now, there are 2 notable aspects that were first introduced in this game. The Create a Player feature, which let players custom make their own players, and the other was being the first game to feature kid versions of real-life athletes. The latter would be the most divisive aspect for many. Some liked it for being able to play as their favorite athletes, while others weren't too fond of it, feeling that adding them would overshadow the main 30 kids, and also felt it took away what made the series stand out from the other sports games. Regardless of how people felt about it, It became a mainstay of the series for a long time until the licenses expired. After that came Backyard Baseball 2001, which went on to be another big hit, then Backyard Basketball, and then more kept coming after that. Between January of 2000 and August of 2006, the series had sold a combined total of 5.3 million units, and Humongous was topping the education software charts. So much so, they began porting them to other game consoles, with varying results. It was so huge, it surpassed other big franchises at the time, like Civilization, Roller Coaster Tycoon, and even EA's Madden series. The funniest and most ironic thing about all the success was, the Humongous higher-ups didn't want the Backyard Sports to outsell the Junior Adventure games. On a side note, Humongous produced a TV special called NFL Football Basics, all about teaching, well, the basics of football, through a mix of live action and animation. This special marks the only time Humongous Entertainment successfully dove into the realm of television. Backing up a bit to the addition of the pros, fascinatingly, the way they were integrated in wasn't all willy-nilly. The crew had to carefully select which ones they were going to feature in the games, and the MLBPA never objected to any of their picks, which shows just how good Humongous' partnership with every league was. When it came to designing their backyard counterparts, the Humongous crew had much more creative freedom in that area compared to the others. In other sports series like Madden, the pros had to look exactly like how they are in real life. With the Backyard Sports, however, the team was able to take some of the pros' most identifiable traits and integrate them into the series style, while also ensuring they look like smaller versions of their adult selves rather than how they looked as kids. Though, not every pro had a particular standout physical trait the team could integrate. As for their skills, they tried not to make them too overwhelmingly popular compared to the Backyard Kids, and one way they did so was by exaggerating some of the pros' weaknesses, like with Mark McGwire's slow running, or Randy Johnson being a poor hitter. Okay, getting back on track, the games so impressed everyone that Humongous received a Kids' Choice Award nomination in 2002, and their partnership was praised by the representatives of the major leagues. In fact, one of the series' biggest fans was Alex Rodriguez, so much so that he already knew a lot about the series when asked to do an interview. You know they made it when one of the biggest baseball players of the time was a fan of their games. So, with all of this success, what happened that led to the series' downfall? Two big things: the dot-com bubble burst and the massive company layoffs. While the games themselves were still doing very well, the company was hit hard financially, and as a result, in an effort to lower costs, they started outsourcing the programming and some of the creative work, and this is reflected in the final games. Beginning with Backyard Hockey, the series was given an overhaul. They redesigned the main cast and changed the overall aesthetic, retired the treehouse menu in favor of a more standard-looking menu, and made other changes fans weren't too keen about. It didn't help either that the animation began to get buggy and the overall atmosphere grew more distant, resulting in the gameplay to suffer. Heck, the same can be said for Backyard Football and Basketball 2004. Backyard Baseball 2003 and Soccer 2004, on the other hand, are clearer cost-saving examples, as they're just repurposed from Baseball 2001 and the MLS edition of Soccer, only with a different voice cast, which in itself received mixed reactions from fans.
That time again. Time for some non-stop baseball fun. This is Sunny Day, and my pal Vinny the Gooch with a hearty hi-ho to ya.
We've got all sorts of baseball fun for you today. Live from the Super Colossal Dome, this is Sunny Day and Vinny the Gooch, ready for another exciting game!
Then, the series made the full switch over to CGI, the only Humongous series to do so, starting with Backyard Baseball 2005. In that same year, they also came up with a new sports game, Backyard Skateboarding, which was notable for having a lot of bugs and glitches, some of which were fixed up in the Game of the Year edition. Also, the controls were changed up where now one had to use the mouse and keyboard simultaneously. However, despite the changes and mixed receptions, the series continued to plug along very well, until the release of Backyard Football 2006 on September 20th, 2005, which sadly is notable for being the final official game made by Humongous Entertainment before the company dissolved. From this point forward until 2013, Atari Inc. assumed full control over the series, starting with Backyard Baseball 2007. And this is where the series really started to go downhill. First, they aged up the main cast to their teenage years, and then later on gave them more realistic looks, which took away a lot of the series' relatability, uniqueness, and charm. Second, it was around this time that some of the kids started getting removed from the rosters, which you can imagine did not sit well with a lot of fans, while also trying to introduce new ones that weren't very well received, the most notorious of which being Joey Mcadoo. This was also when production on the series was handed off to a variety of companies, and it's very evident that less care was being put into them, to the point where a lot of people were now viewing the series as nothing more than a blatant cash cow. Not helped by the fact that critics were not too kind to the later entries either. In 2010, Atari Inc. did try to bring the series back to its early roots with the release of Sandlot Sluggers and Rookie Rush, but the end result was not well received. Sure, they no longer had the major sports league licenses, and there was more effort put into the voice acting, adding in new power-ups, giving the characters a more cartoony look, and even going as far as making a prologue comic strip. Many of the problems people had with the later entries still persisted. The characters were still teens, with even more of them being removed to the point where only 8 of the original 30 remained, and the controls were still as complicated as ever. Needless to say, it didn't pay off and the series ended up going dormant. In 2013, amidst their bankruptcy, Atari sold Backyard Sports to the Evergreen Group for its portfolio company, Epic Gear, who then later sold it to Day 6 Sports Group. Day 6 tried their hands at reviving the series with the development of 2 new mobile games, Backyard Baseball and Basketball 2015, released on January 8th and February 6, 2015 respectively. Unfortunately, both games were panned harshly and were downloaded less than 5,000 times. Thus, the series once again fell into dormancy, and as of 2021, there hasn't been a new entry made. However, that's not the end of it. In 2016, it had been reported that a film based on the games was being developed by Cross Creek Pictures and Crystal City Entertainment, with Ari Daniel Pincock and Brian Oliver as producers. No new updates have been made since March of that year, though the CCE executive, Stuart Avi Savitsky, said that it's currently in development and that they are actively working to move the project forward. Yeah, we'll see about that. Unfortunately, because of various licensing issues with some of the former pros, it's very unlikely the older games will see any kind of re-release. Though, never say never. Backyard Sports may have had a lot of ups and downs, but at its core, it did capture that nostalgic feeling of playing sports as a kid, which permeated the early titles and why they're fondly remembered to this day, with its large cast of fun and memorable characters, fun power-ups, and had an overall warmth and charm that just made you feel good playing them. Next time, we'll be taking a dive into the realm of obscurity, as we'll uncover the story of one of Humongous's most forgotten games.
Okay, don't tell the other kids, but I speak English. I learned Spanish in school.